Okay, so today we're picking up with Chapter 13, looking more in depth at the presidency. So there are various different roles that the president holds, or that he does, and so we're going to be looking at some of them. The first is that he is the chief of state, which means that he is a symbol for all of the people in the United States. And so he's like our ceremonial head of state. When things happen, that's who we look to for guidance, kind of thing. The second role is that he's our chief executive. That power is given to him by the Constitution, and that means that he is kind of the leader in both domestic and foreign powers. The third is that he is the chief administrator, and as an administrator of the largest government in the world, he employs about 3 million civilians within that government. So he is the head of this large government machine, at one of the largest employers in the world. The fourth is that he's a chief diplomat, which means he's just our chief spokesperson. So again, like when things happen in the world, that's who they go to for, that's who like the media goes to for a statement on what's the U.S. position on this event and that kind of thing. The fifth is he acts as our commander-in-chief, which means he has direct and immediate control over roughly 500,000 men and women in uniform, as well as our arsenal around the world. And so he can send them places, he can utilize them as he sees fit. The sixth is that he is our chief legislator, which just means that he kind of has an overall congressional agenda, which is going to be what he kind of helps to determine for Congress by initiating and suggesting and requesting different laws to be passed. The seventh is that he is the party chief. Being the leader of his political party in the highest position in the United States makes him the leader of the entire party. The eighth is that he is the chief citizen, and as chief citizen, he's supposed to be representative of all American people, that he is supposed to provide that moral leadership, that we are to look to him for moral guidance. Not always is that the best case, depending on what president it is. Sometimes they screw up more than normal people do, but that is who we look to for our moral leadership. And so anytime that we have a president that kind of messes up, that's a huge issue for the election, that they're not providing us with that moral guidance, that moral leadership. So when we look at the presidency, there are certain formal qualifications that have to be held that are drawn up in the Constitution. The first is that they must be a natural-born citizen, which means that they are naturally a U.S. citizen. So they're either born in the U.S. or their parents were U.S. citizens, but they come by that naturally. They don't pass a test. They don't become a citizen through a procedure. It's because they were born that way. The second is that they have a minimum age of 35, and their residency requirement is that they have to have lived in the U.S. for at least 14 years. Now, that does not have to be consecutive years, so it doesn't have to be all 14 in a row. And the reason this provision was put in the Constitution is because there were a lot of political people or political families that served as ambassadors in foreign countries, and so they would spend many years in France or Great Britain or around the world and not technically live in the U.S. And so this provision said that, well, in order to be kind of in touch with the American people, maybe you need to spend some time here. And so it doesn't matter when those 14 years were, if it was the first 14 or the last 14 that you've lived in the U.S. It just means that you have to have spent some time in the U.S. So when we look at the president's term, again, this is something that is set by Congress. It is by the Constitution, and it sets that you have a 4-year term. The president has a 4-year term, and it used to be kind of a no third term tradition that it started with George Washington. George Washington said 2 terms was enough, 8 years is long enough, let somebody else take the reins and take the job, kind of thing. And so that became a tradition. It doesn't actually become legal or bound by law to be that until the 22nd Amendment, which was passed in 1951. And so that's why you get 2 terms today. And that tradition was broken by FDR. Franklin Roosevelt broke it by running and getting elected to a 3rd term, and then running and getting elected to a 4th term, although he didn't serve his entire 4th term. Anyway, so according to our Constitution, then, the president can serve 2 terms of his own, his or her own. I keep saying his because it's always been men, but, so bear with me on that. Doesn't mean that women can't run, they do. But anyway, so there's 2 terms of their own, and they can serve 2 years of their predecessor. So if they were, like, vice president under another president and he dies halfway through, then they can become president and then run for 2 more terms of their own, 2 additional terms of their own. So it's a maximum of 10 years. So they can't run for president and serve 2 terms and then serve 2 more years. That's not how it works. It only works if they take over in the case of a president dying and they move up because they're vice president to president. So, within the U.S., there's been a lot of discussion and debate on whether or not we should keep the 22nd Amendment. And remember, the 22nd Amendment is the one that limits the presidency to 2 terms. And it keeps coming up, this issue of should we get rid of it. It came up with the Truman administration, which was right after FDR's. He was the very next president. Eisenhower, who people really liked. Reagan, who people really liked as a president. They wanted him these presidents to continue in their presidency. So opponents of repealing it, so these are the people that don't want to get rid of it, they say that it's a safeguard against tyranny. It's a safeguard against someone taking too much power, too much control. That we need to have these limitations to prevent that from happening. On the other hand, you have supporters who say, yes, we need to get rid of this 22nd Amendment because it's very undemocratic, because it is limiting the will of the people. It limits the right of the people to decide who should be president. If they want the president to be in power for 12 years, they should be able to have that president in power for 12 years. They also say, well, if we get rid of it, or if we can get rid of it, having this 22nd Amendment, having this limitation on the amount of terms they can have, it undercuts the authority of the president, because basically halfway through their second term, they're kind of a lame duck that everybody knows that they could potentially be gone, so people kind of forget to listen to them, or they just let them go away, kind of thing. So especially in that second term, it's really hard for them to get things accomplished and done. There's others who say, okay, let's just get rid of the 22nd Amendment, but let's extend the presidential term. Let's change the presidential term. Let's have a single 6-year term. So they're there longer, but they only get to serve for 1 term. So that's been kind of an issue, too, that's been brought up, or a suggestion that has been brought up. And basically they said, well, if we do that, that would free the president from having the pressures of getting reelected, of campaigning for that second term. So then they can focus on the real things that matter, like our budget and foreign policy and domestic issues, rather than worrying about getting reelected, so that they can then worry about economics and the budget and all that stuff. So there's been a lot of controversy about that they can concentrate on those more pressing issues with just a single 6-year term. So there's that. In terms of the pay and benefits that the president receives, their salary is fixed by Congress. They cannot raise it or lower it during their term. So just because Congress maybe doesn't like what the president is doing, they can't say halfway through, oh, we're going to cut your salary in half. They can't do that. They can only raise or lower it in a presidential election year. So every 4 years they can reevaluate. So currently the president gets $400,000 a year with about $50,000 a year allowances for different expenses. Some of the benefits that come with this that are in addition to the salary, they get to live in the White House, they get access to Air Force One and Marine One, which are the airplane and helicopter that transport the president and other key officials to places. Camp David, they have access to that, and that's kind of like a resort area that they can use for relaxation. It's got like a golf course and swimming pool and recreational facilities and that kind of thing. They also get free health care, and they get travel and entertainment funds as well. Once they are no longer president, they do receive a pension. So once they're out of the presidency, they receive a pension for the rest of their life, and that pension is $143,800 a year. In addition to that, their widows, so when they die and their wives are still alive, their widows also receive a pension of $20,000 a year. They also continue to get the benefit of having Secret Service protection until their death. So they are protected from whack jobs out there doing crazy things, trying to hold them hostage and stuff. So that's also kind of a benefit that goes with it. In terms of presidential succession and the vice presidency, so who becomes the next president should the president die, there have been 9 vice presidents who have become president by succession. That the president that they served under died and they became, or sorry, not all of them died. They either were removed from office or they died. So that has set up what the succession is with who becomes president next. And so the succession is, obviously, it goes to the vice president first. Well, what happens if in some strange calamity the president and the vice president both die? Well, then it goes to the Speaker of the House. So, what happens if all 3 of them should die in this horrible tragedy? Then it goes to the President pro tempore. Well, why would it go to the President pro tempore? Well, the President pro tempore is that senator who is elected to take over if the Vice President isn't there. Remember, the Vice President serves as the President of the Senate, and so if he's not there, then somebody has to come up and take over. So that's the President pro tempore. So basically, it goes in order of who's got the most authority. So you got the Vice President, and then the Speaker of the House, and then the President pro tempore. And then the 4th level is that it's the cabinet officers in the order that the office was created. And so for the test, you're only going to need to know the first 4, and that's the Secretary of State, Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of Defense, and the Attorney General. So you don't need to know all 15, you just need to know the top 4. So that gives us 7 people that are in line for the presidency. So if the president should die, it goes to the vice president. Then it goes to the Speaker of the House, then it goes to the President pro tempore, and then to the cabinet officers, which are the Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Defense, and the Attorney General. So what happens if the president doesn't die? What if he's just disabled? Like he cannot perform his job as he should? Well, the 25th Amendment is going to cover that. And the 25th Amendment says that if the president is disabled, like they are out of commission, they're not dead, but they're out of commission, they can't perform their job, then it goes to the vice president. Vice president becomes president if one of 2 things happens. Either, number 1, the president says so in writing to Congress that he is incapable of fulfilling his duties. So maybe he's aware enough that he cannot, like he's got maybe mental disabilities, or for one instance that this was used was when Reagan went under surgery, so he was going to be out of commission. He was put under, right? He's put asleep for the surgery, so he was incapable of performing his presidential duties. I mean, what happened if something like a terrorist attack or something had happened and we needed to deal with it right away? He wouldn't have been able to make those decisions, to make those calls. And so for a very short amount of time, Vice President Bush was president of the United States midway through Reagan's administration. So that's one instance. The second is that if the vice president and the majority of the cabinet write to Congress and say that the president is having some issues and are incapable of doing their job, then they need to be replaced. So then the vice president takes over. And so if they notice something that is making it impossible for the president to fulfill his duties, they can let Congress know. And Congress makes that decision then to take away the president's power and give it to the vice president. So the president is able to resume their power after informing Congress that he's capable. So like when Reagan came out of the surgery, as soon as he felt like he was up to it, he got his powers back. The vice president and the cabinet can always challenge that and say, we don't think you're quite ready. And Congress has 21 days to respond and say, okay, we reevaluate and we think you're right that he's not ready for this. Like I said, this has only been used one time, and it was during Reagan's surgery, and so they conferred power to his vice president, which was George H.W. Bush, for a period of 7 hours and 54 minutes. So it wasn't even really that long of time, but you know, if a crisis had happened, we needed to have that leadership and know who was going to be taken over. So we have the vice president, and the vice presidency has often been called the job that's only a heartbeat away from having the power. Other than being almost president, or only a heartbeat away from being president, the vice president really has two duties. The first is to preside over the Senate, which we already talked about. And the second is to help decide the question of presidential disability, to decide if his boss is capable. So that's really the only two things that constitutionally the vice president has to do. But the importance of the vice presidential office has become more and more apparent in recent years. Typically, when they are selecting who's going to be the vice president, they try to pick somebody who's going to balance the ticket during the nomination and election process. So whoever's the president, they're going to look for somebody to sort of offset maybe whatever deficiencies the president has. Maybe the president's really old, so they're going to find somebody who's a younger vice president. Maybe they've got somebody who's not good at foreign affairs or who has very little experience at foreign affairs. So they're going to find a vice presidential candidate who can cover that, who brings that experience. So that's something that they do. Now, the vice presidency has actually been vacant too, 18 times in our history, 9 times because they succeeded to the presidency, so now there's no vice president, and twice it's been because the vice president has resigned, and 7 times it's been because they died while in office. So 18 times of having no vice president. Well, again, the 25th Amendment covers this, and that's how we get a new vice president. What happens is that the president nominates a new vice president who is then confirmed by a majority in both houses. They don't have to go through an election. And so this is a way that a vice president can get the job without actually having been elected to the position. More recently, vice presidents have had much larger roles in government than just serving with the Senate and deciding presidential disability. And that kind of started with Al Gore. Al Gore was very involved in the cabinet meetings. He was a member of the National Security Council, and he served as one of the top advisors to the president. The kind of nice thing about the vice presidential job is that no matter what you do, the president cannot fire you. The only thing that could happen is that you could be impeached from your job. You can be kicked out by Congress, but the president can't fire you. So you kind of have some job security there. The next thing is presidential selection. Originally in the Constitution, it was written that the person who received the most amount of electoral votes became the president, and the person who received the second highest became the vice president. Now, in the very first election with George Washington, that was okay because there was no political parties, and so it worked out. But in the next election, there were political parties, and so that is going to create problems because if you have two very, very strong individuals that gained a lot of votes, somebody comes in first, somebody comes in second, but they're from two different political parties, one's going to become the president and the other's going to become the vice president, that's going to cause a lot of conflict in the executive branch. And so when you look at the election of 1796, you had the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, both very, very strong parties. John Adams was running for the Federalists, and Thomas Jefferson was running for the Democratic Republicans. And so it ended up, after the end of the election, according to the Constitution, John Adams became the president because he got the most electoral votes, and second runner-up was Thomas Jefferson, who became his vice president. Now, these two used to be friends until they figured out that they had some very, very different ideas on politics, and so that term of of John Adams' presidency was not a pleasant one by any means, because Jefferson was constantly challenging his decisions. And so 4 years go by, and we get the election of 1800. And by that time, they had figured out how to solve this problem, and they solved it with the 12th Amendment. And what the 12th Amendment does is it says that the president and the vice president run on the same ticket. So they are a combo group rather than first place gets this, second place gets this. And so it is solved by the 12th Amendment. And so then we've not had any problems with that ever since. So the next video we'll be looking at the election process and getting into how this electoral college stuff works.